Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Hunter Jones, the Climate and Health Project Manager in NOAA's Climate Program Office.
And I'm Nora Randall. I'm a Canals Fellow for 2021, working in the Climate Program Office.
And we're here to welcome you to the second webinar in our series of the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, NIHIS, Urban Heat Island Community of Practice. In the first webinar, we learned about the physical hazard of extreme heat on several spatial scales, which lines up with the first U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit's Steps to Resilience, the first of the steps, which is explore hazards. In today's session, we will move on to the second step to resilience, which is assess vulnerability and risk. We have four fantastic speakers, starting with Katie Conlon of UC Davis and Evan Mallon of the Georgia Institute of Technology. And they'll give us a brief but thorough foundational talk on the basics of constructing a social vulnerability index or heat vulnerability index. Then we'll move on to two case studies on social vulnerability indices that were created to inform decision-making in cities. The first will be in Yonkers, New York, covered by Oded Holzinger, an urban planner and climate resiliency manager in Yonkers. And the second will focus on Oahu, Hawaii, and will be delivered by Matt Gonser, the Director of the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Following the presentations, we'll have ample time for questions and answers, moderated by Katie and Evan. And so I want to just remind everybody a few things. All the sessions in this series will be recorded and posted to the NIHIS website. We encourage you to ask questions at any time using the questions feature of GoToWebinar, which you should see in the control panel. And with that, I would say, let's send it over to Katie and Evan and get started. Please take it away. I'll pass control of the screen to you.
Great, thanks. So I think Evan is going to handle the slides for me. So Evan, if you don't mind, I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Katie Conlon. I'm an assistant professor at UC Davis, and I will be jointly presenting this with Dr. Evan Mallon, who is an affiliate researcher at Georgia Tech's Urban Climate Lab. And so we're going to be talking, as Hunter just mentioned, about mapping heat vulnerability indices. So as we get that loaded, we're assuming that there is a bit of familiarity with what heat vulnerability indices are. You can go to the next slide, Evan, if you don't mind. These are becoming quite common, and part of the reason for that is because these are tools that can be used to make decisions, and they're really useful because they provide one measure of what we're calling vulnerability, and they do this in a way that presents vulnerability in a spatial capacity. And so it allows you to see spatial distribution of heat vulnerabilities so that you can develop some type of targeted intervention so that you can reduce risk. And you can see here on the right, perhaps one of the more familiar heat vulnerability maps that was created by Dr. Colleen Reed and published in 2009. And this methodology is one that's commonly used, and I'll review that fairly quickly. But it should be noted, and it was published in 2018 by the EPA, that there is really no one approach, no one best method for mapping vulnerability. And Dr. Mallon will talk about why this is, because it is an iterative process. But vulnerability mapping is really important to think about what your intended outcome is. In our next slide, we'll see that vulnerability is very much a function of three main components. Next slide. And those three main components traditionally are exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and those come up with this end result of vulnerability. And in our next slide, I show some of these common vulnerability indicators that are used to comprise exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure, when we're thinking about heat, is often characterized as the number of hot days, the number of consecutive hot days. Oftentimes, if you can't get the number of those days, you can use measures of land surface temperature, vegetation as a proxy for surface temperature, land cover, since we know that the urban heat island is often implicated in a vulnerability to heat. Population density can also be associated with these exposures. Sensitivity indicators, so people who are at risk to extreme heat, those who, so we know from the epidemiological literature, those who are older, those who are living alone, people who are younger, those who have already existing health conditions can be more likely to succumb to extreme heat. So we consider those sensitivity factors. And then this idea of adaptive capacity, so the ability to respond during an extreme heat event. Common indicators listed here. It's a growing area of research, but oftentimes we think about the ability to cool oneself using AC, education as the proxy for SES, socioeconomic status, and some other abilities to cool oneself are considered adaptive capacity indicators. In our next slide, I show how these indicators over time, so since 2005, and I should just note that this is in the peer review literature and it's certainly not comprehensive, but you can see that there's this range of the number of indicators that are used to capture what heat vulnerability index is. Indices are being created. And I just want to point out that this is in the peer review literature, right? Oftentimes these indices are being created by municipalities, so they're not often being published. So there's a lot of information that's being put out there on heat vulnerability indices that aren't necessarily being captured in the peer review literature. In our next slide, we see the common methods that are being used, and this is just a very simple approach at demonstrating what this can look like. So on the bottom, we're moving upwards to complexity. The first, most simple way that you can present heat vulnerability index is by mapping just the individual indicators. So these might be, let's say you're mostly concerned about people who are of an older age. You might just map that simple indicator. And then moving up more simply, you take two or three indicators and unweighted, just assume that they equal the same amount. You overlay them, but add them together. And in these next three categories, I should note the additive, overlay, and then up to principal component analysis, you're doing a normalization and an aggregation. So essentially you're normalizing individual indicators from 0 to 1, and then you're aggregating them you're aggregating them so that they are increasing in vulnerability. So these input variables are unidirectional so that they confer vulnerability as you add them together. And then the most common HVI method that I think we'll be talking most about is the principal component analysis. And this is a dimension reduction technique that is, the main goal is to reduce the potential for autocorrelation, and it produces statistically significant individual factors that you can that are associated with vulnerability indicators. So in our next slide, I just want to point out how these common outputs look like. On the left, we have a map of New York State that's by county, but within each county, you can see the census tracts that are given vulnerability values. And in this particular map, they demonstrate that within each county, you have a lot of spatial heterogeneity of vulnerability. And on the right is an example of a more refined spatial scale within Puerto Rico. San Juan is being mapped here, and their scale, they actually, I just want to point out, they don't have it listed as numbers, but they call their index from very low vulnerability to very high vulnerability. And in the next slide, these are the results of a more complex vulnerability index that Dr. Mallon and I created, where we were looking in the city of Detroit. And ultimately, what we were wanting to do was see at a city-wide scale what would happen if we took health observations and incorporated it while we created our index, and where we only included variables in the index creation that were associated statistically with health outcomes along the way. And as you can see, there wasn't as much variation in that output. And Dr. Mallon will continue to talk a bit about some of that variability in the remaining slides.
All right, thank you, Dr. Conlon. So in this very same study, we had a set of findings that we wanted to share with you that shows just how important the inputs are in your HVI results. And so what we see here is actually a composite of 4 different HVIs, where the only thing that we change between these HVIs is the exposure input. So this was inputs such as impervious surface, lack of tree canopy, lack of vegetation, these kinds of proxies for temperature that went into the HVI exposure component. So what you see here is the frequency at which each census tract was identified by an HVI to be within the top 25% of vulnerability. And you can see that there's some agreement in some census tracts. Follow the black here, where you can see that all 4 HVIs agreed that this is a tract that we should pay attention to. This is the top 25% vulnerability in all 4 of our HVIs. But not all the HVIs agree. And in fact, any scale of gray that you see here shows that at least one of the HVIs considered that to be in the top quartile of vulnerability. So depending on the inputs that you select, and here, just exposure alone, the data source varying will give you different HVI results. So HVIs can be very sensitive to those inputs, so it's important that they're selected carefully for your local context. The next sensitivity we want to highlight here is the construction method. So Dr. Conlon just talked about how many different construction methods there are, and they vary in complexity. What we see here are 4 different HVIs that use the same indicators, but 4 different construction methods. And as you can see here, they start to highlight different neighborhoods depending on how you put them together. So the construction method that you choose is also going to be important when determining your relative prioritization for where you focus on your interventions. And finally, HVIs can be very sensitive to scale as well. This is the exact same method, the exact same inputs, but 2 different scales. On the left, you see here, this is census tract, and then on the right, we have block group. And depending on even the scale that you select, you might see some different neighborhoods show up or not show up, depending on what scale you decide to run your HVI at. And so Dr. Conlon showed several different scales, statewide down to urban scale. And so this actually does make a very big difference, or can make a big difference on your HVI results. And so let's talk a little bit more about that construction method. So what you see here is a schematic showing principal components analysis, where as Dr. Conlon mentioned, you take all of your indicators, you combine them, you aggregate them through PCA, where you get statistically independent factors that you may or may not be able to associate with your inputs. And you aggregate them and you get your final HVI score. And that might look something like this. So this is an HVI score for the city of Atlanta, where actually we put in 10 different indicators through PCA. And you get this score. It highlights a few neighborhoods here in the west side of the city. But the more that you put into your HVI and the more sophisticated your statistical methods to aggregate them, the less you actually are able to connect directly to your interventions. So we know we should do something in these areas, but because of all this, this long procedure we've gone through, we don't know exactly what we should do there. And so what we recommend actually is to take the time to move up and down this scale of complexity, break it down a little bit more, maybe start to look into some of the individual indicators in addition to your composite HVI. And so here's an example of the same HVI in Atlanta, but we break it down. So here's an indicator of sensitivity. This is elderly population over 65 years old, where we have the north and the west highlighted. Whereas on the right, we have just average land surface temperature. That's a proxy for exposure, where we see actually the west and the north are pretty protective. That's our lowest priority area, whereas downtown is our highest priority area. So you might actually break this down in a way that in our high sensitivity areas, you have one kind of response like cooling centers, whereas in your high exposure areas, you have a different kind of response such as tree planting. So we actually have this, this set of recommendations where if you break it down into the constituent parts, the sensitivity or adaptive capacity, exposure, and that overall vulnerability, that might actually imply different interventions that you might take. The sensitivity adaptive capacity is where you might implement more of your shorter term emergency response type interventions. This might also be your community-based adaptations. This might be something like opening cooling centers or having phone trees, like the New York City Be a Buddy program, where volunteers can actually call elderly constituents who do opt into the program to get calls during things like extreme heat events to make sure that they're okay. Whereas the exposure, this is where you focus more on your longer term heat mitigation response. Things like tree planting, cool materials, these take time to implement. Those trees need time to grow. And so this is where you might focus some of the heat mitigation interventions. Whereas the overall vulnerability, where that is the highest, depending on how you choose to define it, that's the all of the above response. That's your highest priority. You want to pilot your projects there. This is also where you want to identify your local stakeholders and champions, meet with them frequently to be able to devise some of these kinds of strategies you might use, like the community-based adaptations. This is where you really want to start your search. So taking all this into consideration, some of our takeaways, considerations for HVI implementation as you start creating your own HVIs. The HVI results may significantly vary depending on the input selected, the construction method, and the scale. So it's going to be up to you to determine all three of those when you're constructing your HVI, and then for how you use it. Carefully selected methods and indicators can inform effective and efficient heat interventions. HVIs are a balancing act between inputs, interpretation, and implementation. Again, it's going to be up to you to determine what goes into it, how you build it, and at what scale you're going to implement it. And the big takeaway here is that HVIs are communication tools. We urge you to engage with the public, engage with the local champions, and to iterate. Learn from them, gather their input on concerns that they may have, get feedback on the strategies you would like to implement, and iterate. You can recreate HVIs as you are using them as these communication tools. So we urge all of you to make this a very active exercise rather than kind of a one-off where you have the HVI and you're done. So it is a very active exercise. That's all we have for you for now. Thank you very much, but we look forward to discussing this with all of you at the end.
Great. Thank you both, Drs. Conlon and Mallon, for that really nice setup. And I really like the framework and the idea of kind of going up and down the scale of complexity. And I also liked your point that, you know, what's in the published literature is only a small subsample of what's out there, which is a really nice segue to the next talk, which will be by Oded Holzinger. Again, this is going to be focused on Yonkers. And let me see if I can pass control. Oh, never mind. You've got it.
This was really great and interesting, and is a great segue also to this case study from Yonkers. So my name is Oded Holzinger. I am the Climate Resilience Manager for Groundwork Hudson Valley. We are an environmental nonprofit based in Yonkers, focusing on environmental justice issues in the city of Yonkers. We have an education program, youth employment and youth leadership program, as well as our climate resiliency program focused on transforming urban locations, urban sites, placemaking. Today, I'm going to discuss with you our latest project of climate safe neighborhoods. It's a national partnership led by groundwork organizations all throughout the United States that uses one method of HVI. But in addition to that, we're also looking at historical reasons and policies which led to the disparities we see in resilience to climate change, mainly in post-industrial cities. So some background on the city of Yonkers for those of you who are less familiar with it. The city of Yonkers is in New York State in the Westchester County along the Hudson River, bordering the New York City borough of the Bronx from the north. It's a city of about 200,000 people. And bottom line, here you can see the heat vulnerability index map that we developed for the city of Yonkers. You can see here that the high vulnerability was identified mainly in Southwest and Southeast Yonkers. And I'm going to break it down now to explain a little bit how we developed this heat vulnerability index, as well as what other factors and variables we took into account that are more qualitative, that help us determine where to focus our efforts for interventions and implementation. So going back to the vulnerability map, as definition of vulnerability, taking into account exposure measure, sensitivity measures, and adaptive capacity measure. In this case, we chose for the exposure measure, of course, to use the land surface temperature. For sensitivity, we're looking at impervious surface and tree. Adaptive capacity, we're looking at percent household in. So here you can see the median surface temperature map for 2013 through 2019, and you can also see the disparities that have to do with both socioeconomic reasons, as well as with the topography of the city and some of the design features. Sensitivity measures, we can start with the impervious surface. So if I go back to the temperature, it's pretty easy to see the relationship, the correlation. And then as somewhat of a mirror image, we can take in the tree canopy factor into account as well, seeing how certain neighborhoods have much greater tree canopy coverage than other neighborhoods. Finally, we're looking at our adaptive capacity measure. As we know, we talk about resilience. Of resilience is the ability of individuals and communities to adapt and change and react to those extreme events. And if it's by paying for electricity bill, for air conditioning, medical bills, so on.
Oded, sorry to interrupt, but I think your connection may be a little bit spotty. So perhaps if you could turn off your webcam, maybe that would conserve bandwidth. It's mostly working now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, please do let me know if that happens again, and I'll try to make my connection even better. So here we can see the final map of the heat vulnerability index, taking into account those three measures. And now to show how we developed it. So of course, the exposure and sensitivity measures were taken from Landsat aerial imagery that was then analyzed to determine those three measures. And the way we calculate our heat vulnerability index is by showing the ratio between the range of the attribute for a specific block group and the general ratio for that specific attribute. And you can see that right here. And then when we look at the table of attributes that we get from it, you see how we have for each block group, we have the value of each one of those measures, the Landsat data, impervious surfaces, tree canopy, as well as the poverty factor. and we then sum those up to get our heat vulnerability index. Now, using that heat vulnerability index and talking about implementation and interventions, we focused to choose on 5 priority neighborhoods in Southwest Yonkers. And here I do want to talk about one qualitative factor, and going back to the last presentation, it's really important to use local knowledge, especially if we're developing a heat vulnerability index that is not just for a single city, but for a county or a state or even the entire country. It's important to then speak to folks on the ground and make sure that it actually fits the situation as they know it. And one example here is that you can see, it's now a little transparent, but you can see in Southeast Yonkers, those census tracts that show as high vulnerability, but we know, for example, that over here it's all shopping centers with not a lot of residents living in there. And so we know that that's not necessarily an area where we would want to focus our efforts for interventions, because the impact on people living there is lower. So that is one example which brought us to select those 5 neighborhoods in Southwest Yonkers. And then finally is for the narrow motive that we bring to this work as we try to promote interventions and mitigation strategies. We're looking at historical reasons that led to these disparities in resilience to extreme heat and flooding. And we can see that those disparities as we look at the heat and the neighborhood boundaries. And a main reason for these disparities is the practice of redline, which in a short presentation I definitely can't do a deep dive into, but essentially throughout much of the 20th ranked different neighborhoods in a few dozen cities with the level of risk for investing and providing mortgages for these neighborhoods, essentially determining which neighborhoods will get great mobility and ability to really move up towards the American dream. And if we look at the redlining map of the city of Yonkers, this was taken from a service called Mapping Inequality. And it's also important to mention that you can see there the original notes the surveyors took, which use race and ethnicity as a major factor to rank the risk level for mortgage support in these neighborhoods. Map of those red line neighborhoods, and I'll just mention that the green is the most desirable, then the blue, yellow is considered to be risky for investment, and red is the highest risk. And we were able to use those maps to show the overlay between those borders that were determined in the 1930s and today's climate change, temperatures, as well as the design factors that led to that. Those red line neighborhoods did not receive many trees and have a lot of parking lots and large buildings that add to the impervious surface. And you can see the overlay, the pretty good overlay between the red line neighborhoods and the heat vulnerability index that we developed using the NOAA's methodology. Yeah, and yeah, we can see from these bar charts also that those red line neighborhoods are much more impervious, have about half the tree canopy coverage than those green line neighborhoods, and is on average about 3 degrees hotter than those green line neighborhoods, and Fahrenheit difference. Just to wrap this up, I'm going to talk a little for a minute about what we're doing about it. So we're organizing those historically redlined communities those with high vulnerability through a climate resiliency task force and we're working with this task force as well as with the city of Yonkers to identify vehicles of change. Those are ongoing plans and projects. If it's a climate action plan the city is about to develop over the next few years, major downtown redevelopment projects. And also we partnered with the City Municipal Housing Authority that has several properties going under construction, and we're making sure that the landscaping is designed to address extreme heat and flooding. Here are some of the local interventions we're working with the city to promote. Of course, tree planting in those treeless streets, shade structures, as we know trees take time. A lot of very old underinvestment parks in those neighborhoods that we would like to see more investment in. As well as green infrastructure, reflective roofs, cooling centers, and more. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know the presentations are going by really quickly, but we're looking forward to a lot of great time for questions and answers. So really nice presentation. Let's move on to the next one, which is going to be Matt Gonser, with the Director of the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency in Oahu, Hawaii. And I think you've got control now, so please take it away.
Great, thank you, Hunter and Nora. It's been great to actually hear the opening presenters. I've learned quite a bit, and it helped me think about what kinds of things I can share out here. You know, we're simultaneously sort of an information collector, data generator, but really an end user of some resources that we have available to us. And I think what's most important is to keep in mind what to do with the information and what can be done. So I hope to share a little bit of the background of what we've been thinking on the past couple of years, but really moving forward, you know, Hunter had some really great questions for us in terms of, you know, what are we doing or thinking about in terms of maintenance? What are the needs? How are any of the indices serving us? And really right now we're in this process of how to merge different streams of thought, where first we had developed a generalized social vulnerability index thinking about climate risk hazards, but now also have additional heat data that we didn't have at that point in time. And how do we, you know, overlay these, learn from them, but really inform what we're doing moving forward. So just very quickly, I wanted to share, you know, the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency was a charter mandated office. The voters elected to establish the office, which is really a testament to the observed changes that they've seen and the awareness of our vulnerability as an island community. And we need to demonstrate and validate that work moving forward. And the real foundation for how we've been engaging community, we were fortunate to be one of the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities. And within that, it was a great educational opportunity to highlight historical inequities and how those kinds of conditions that have created vulnerabilities for people need to be addressed simultaneously as we're tackling the risk and need to address climate security. And obviously climate change is clear and present, and you know that was really the thesis by which the voters elected our office. And we would be, I know we're talking about heat vulnerability indices, but we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention the driver of climate change and the reality that we as a community, you all on the webinar and globally, need to do everything we can to drastically sorry, I got a question. Never mind, that was a disregard. Simultaneously eliminate our contributions to global climate change, but we also know that there's so much baked into the system that even if we turned it off tomorrow, change will keep coming to our shoreline. So we also need to prepare communities for the reality of that change. And across the board, you know, climate change is not just heat, but we know that there are many climate changes that are having varied and widely extreme impacts to our island communities. But today we're keyed in focusing on heat. And again, just wanted to stress the reality of the opportunity to bend that curve, a lot of the discussion of bending the curve around the COVID pandemic, but we know we have the ability to stave off some of the worst conditions moving forward, and the climate assessment report that came out from the IPCC most recently was a stark reminder of that need and that opportunity. But not only the changes moving forward locally, it's really been top of mind for the state and our island of Oahu. 2019 was a record temperature year amongst a record temperature decade, where we were seeing almost daily ties or new records statewide. And amidst all this, as I mentioned, we were developing the Oahu Resilience Strategy, and we had these community working groups, and there was one that was really keyed in on natural hazard mitigation and preparedness. And really at that point in time, they asked the question of like, how do we better understand the potential disparate impacts that could result from any of these climate magnified natural hazards? And it was within that framework that we started this discussion of a social vulnerability index. And we expanded the working group to include more participants to really pull in what data was relevant. We were all very aware of some of the nationwide tools and other things that existed, like the CDC, but we saw this as an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into our local context. And as I mentioned, we were fortunate that we had some additional support through our strategy partner, AECOM, at that point in time, really thinking about localizing the information so that we can identify some of those areas and really thinking about what to do moving forward. I'm very grateful that Dr. Conlon already explained principal component analysis, because I probably would do it a disservice, but just wanted to share with you that that is the process by which we went through to really think about what was most relevant to our community. But the reality is, that information is stagnant, right? It's a snapshot. It itself was based on what was available at that point in time, which was 2015 American Community Survey information. So really, as we move forward, census data just became available. What level of accuracy or precision do we really need to think about taking action and addressing these challenges? And that's a question that we're asking ourselves right now as well. Similarly, working with a new state health equity office that was just stood up. They're looking to learn about what the 4 counties have done to see how we could potentially standardize some of this information as a small state, so that we could better share resources and community education as well as community awareness moving forward. Long story short, this is that snapshot. This is our overall principal component analysis, a relative social vulnerability index. Some of the key variables that surfaced included income, age, mobility, and a few other health related. But we didn't really have any of that environmental input that Evan was sharing in terms of developing a specific heat vulnerability index at that point in time. Since then, we've been fortunate to be one of many cities now growing over the past several years to partner with the Climate Program Office and others to develop our own community heat assessment. What you see here is the afternoon heat index for Oahu based on data collected on August 31st, 2019, which actually just happened to be a record day, tying Honolulu's record temperature amidst that record-setting year. And we're really looking at this information, and you might be wondering, why is it all sort of splotchy and big areas aren't included? What you see in terms of the heat index spectrum is really where the communities live. So across Oahu, we have a wide range from rural to urban, and some of the most urban census tracts in the nation. But we wanted to better understand the impacts to people in place and not just focus in on the urban core. So we're trying to better understand this information, use it for supporting our operating agencies, thinking about development and redevelopment, understanding the conditions that have led to these high heat indices in these different areas, but also thinking about the immediate potential shocks from a heat wave and looking at other communities across the country grappling with that right now, but then also keeping our eye on the horizon of the long-term systemic things that we need to do to address increasing temperatures and buffer and mitigate that growing risk into the future. So as part of an education effort, really just an internal exploration for ourselves, we developed a series of heat vulnerability maps so that we could continue to explore the data, use it as a conversation piece, but really to keep using it to build constituencies, inform educator leaders and elected officials to drive action, right? We know we need to do something to address the problem. And here's just another example from that story map series where you have the opportunity to look at simultaneously both the heat index and the social vulnerability index itself. But again, is this the resource that we need or want moving forward? That's an open question right now, because frankly, we probably wouldn't have the resources or the capacity to, or the know-how to do that methodology of a primary principal component analysis. And I think as we progress on, updated information for nationwide tools, or again, even working at the statewide level, we might see that there are other ways that we can get at understanding the issue, which I think is clear and present, and then doing something about it. So as Evan mentioned, working up and down those different scales. Because really at the end of the day, we're just trying to understand ecosystem and human health. Not that trees are the only means to address increasing temperatures, but I think just anyone walking around their neighborhood, they can understand and appreciate the different conditions and what do we as city government do to rectify or overcome some of those past inequities, whether you're in a park or open space or along a new transit corridor, in a park with your grandchildren. And fortunately, we have a lot of excited people that are supporting us on inventorying and connecting with community on these critical issues. So lastly, as I wrap up, it's not just the human health. We also need to recognize the needs and resources to invest and support these kinds of elements that will help us address heat moving forward. And Oded talked about those kinds of community partnerships as well. And then lastly, we understand amongst our spectrum of key climate hazard risks that heat really is one of our top two climate hazards. And this is a snapshot from an ongoing project called Climate Ready Oahu. And really it's because when looking at risk as a function of consequence and likelihood, we are guaranteed. We know that temperatures will continue to increase into the near term, and that is really dependent on what we do or do not do with respect to addressing the climate change driver, which is greenhouse gas pollution. And then what we are excited about moving forward, we've been partnering with NOAA and the US Forest Service as we are about to receive updated land cover data. We're simultaneously working with US Forest Service to get us a tool and a resource that exists in the state of California so that we can look at some of this data simultaneously. And again, for us as local government, we don't really always have the capability to maintain and do our own investigations. So we need to be creative and really think about being able to best access and utilize any of the resources that are out there to really drive towards evidence-informed decision-making and continue to build those constituencies into the future. So with that, thank you, and I'll hand it back to Nora.
Hello. So I'd like to invite Catherine and Evan back to moderate our Q&A session.
Great. Thank you. Those are wonderful. Thank you all. So we have a few questions, and I just want to encourage everyone to add more into our chat feature because I think we have a lot that we could discuss. If anyone's ever talked about heat vulnerability indices with me, they know I could talk about them for forever. So we'll just get started in the order that they came. So this first one comes from Rob Graff. This is for Oded. We're wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about the thought process that you had about the weighting for your variables. in some of the particular attributes that they had and why you selected them and why you weighted them or how you weighted them in your process.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Rob, for your wonderful question. Again, we took the different factors. We took canopy cover, impervious surfaces, and the percentage of people living under the poverty line. The way we calculated it, as I showed the formula, we gave each variable got a value between 0 and 1, and then as we combine those values, we got to our heat vulnerability index. Now a little bit about why we chose each one of them. So since we worked on this project within the context of understanding the historical processes which lead to the disparities of heat in the city of Yonkers, as well as in other cities that are going through this process, we wanted to show specifically for the sensitivity measures the issue of impervious surface and tree canopy, because these are two design features that had to do with public investment in the public space of these neighborhoods. If it's the how many street trees are there, how many parks are there, and even in the condition of the housing stock, and whether there are or there aren't private green spaces that can accommodate tree and green space. And then when it comes to the impervious surface, we also know that those underinvested neighborhoods ended up being the NIMBY for where a lot of usage, such as industrial sites, big parking lots, ended up being. And so we noted these are two measures that have to do with the design decisions that were taken throughout the years and that have a major impact on the level of heat. Trees, we all know the impact of trees on reducing surface temperature, but also, of course, as an emergency as an emergency way to handle heat, as they provide shade for folks that don't have their own outdoor space. And when it comes to the impervious surfaces, we all know that these are major contributors to the urban heat island effect, as they take in the heat during the day, especially where there are less trees. They have much greater exposure to heat and to the sun, essentially preventing the nighttime cooling effect, which allows for neighborhoods with less impervious surface to kind of cool off during the nighttime. And then finally, we chose to focus on the percent of people living under the poverty line. I spoke about it a little bit during the presentation, because our point of view is, again, trying to identify the most vulnerable communities and look at it while we use the satellite imagery, the bird's eye view, to see those different factors. We want to think about it really from the less very hot street, and we understand that the ability of these communities to adapt and change has a lot to do with their socioeconomic status. So these are the main three factors. I can also speak about a major factor that we were missing, which is the health indicators. And that has to do with the fact that we chose to focus on the block group and the census tracts. And unfortunately, in Yonkers, and that is true for many localities around the United States, there is a lack of data that has this geographic specificity to it, so that we could really show the correlation between things like hospitalization due to heat-related conditions and the heat vulnerability index that we developed. So that's something that we hope we could also add to our index in the future.
Great. Well, thank you both. I think that these were some really stellar cases, and I have a question actually for both of you. So both of you mentioned, we have a climate resiliency task force. Matt was talking about building constituencies, and we were recommending that we use HVIs as an engagement tool. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you how you've been using these vulnerability assessments for engagement. What kind of stakeholder feedback you've been able to get?
Yeah, and a unique position within local government because we're simultaneously trying to educate and inform community members so that they can perhaps get motivated. But we don't want to shame government because we are government and we need to work with everyone to just come to the grips with what the information is telling us to inform what we do better moving forward. So it's been a little both and, we're equal opportunity pushers of information. You ask us to a webinar, we're coming, and we're happy to extend that information moving forward. But I think it's a little bit wait and see, right? Because we don't want to necessarily just paint this dire picture without the next steps and what we're actively going to try to do to address it. So we're doing both and. I wouldn't say that we've gone full hog on a total heat campaign, but I can tell you that we have a city climate change commission who is an independent advisory body, and they are picking up heat as their next sort of theme of interest. And we're doing those reaching out. I think what is fortunate or the opportunity that we have is to even just connect with other municipalities. That's usually our best entree to work with our city colleagues. Even if they say the same exact thing that we said, hearing it from someone else sometimes helps. And it's really just keeping it all moving forward. But we don't want to just say oh, we need more information, we need more data. I used to work at a university in an extension service, Sea Grant, and that was always a difficult thing when we would hear that from researchers, when the community members in government was just look, we need some help. We don't need all of the information. We need to be informed about how to do something moving forward. And I think really that's our back and forth right now on the vulnerability indices. Frankly, I don't really talk about the existing social vulnerability index that we have so much anymore because it's quite old. A lot of things have changed through COVID. And I think what's needed is really more of that environmental and physical data that Evan, you addressed, and we're slowly working towards all that, but we don't want to just wait for analysis paralysis. We need to just keep doing the things that we know are going to address the current and future risks. And that's not to say everyone knows the answers, but it's the how you deploy this toolkit of things that is most important.
Yeah, and I can add to that from our experience. We've been in this project for about a little more than a year now. We've been involved in the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership. And what I can say, and we met with many community members, many stakeholders, as well as many partners we have in the city of Yonkers and the Westchester County. When we show them the impervious surface and the tree canopy heat, those maps, I found it really show people things they might already be aware of because they walked those tree-lined neighborhoods and they walked those treeless neighborhoods and they felt the so sometimes it's things people are aware of, but when you show them the map, when you show something really clicks in, and those many experiences they have from the city kind of come together through this map, through this communication tool. And I think that that's really important to organize those experiences and think about them in the context of social justice, of disparity and climate change. And when we show those overlays with the redlining map, and that is, we are a nonprofit, but we have a lot of sensitivity around that topic because we are partnering with the government and we're not trying to go against the city. They're an important partner for this project, of course. But we saw that when we show those redlining maps overlaid with the vulnerability and the heat maps, some jaws are dropped and people can really see the connection and understand also, as we show them those design features which led to those results, understand. And I can even say that we're even getting support to this project from the banking industry, which also is aware of their responsibility and their part in this in this process. Which and lastly, I just want to I had one more point to add, but it slipped out of my mind now. So I could go back to it later if I remember.
Well, I'm wondering if I could build off of these comments, because I think that it might be useful for some. So the examples that we gave were heavily focused on urban centers, right? And we know, I mean, just in the last few weeks, right? I mean, it's not just the last few weeks, but certainly in the last couple of years, we know that our rural counterparts, especially in the United States, it's globally, but in the United States, certainly our rural counterparts are experiencing awful extreme heat. So how might you, in your experience in talking about your heat vulnerability indices and your mapping of heat vulnerability, might you, what recommendations would you have to colleagues that want to do this for more rural populations? Knowing that the population is a little bit different and the audience might be a little bit different, but still some of the sensitivities and how you communicate those risks will still be there. And what would you recommend, just given your experiences? I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, and maybe back to you and Evan, but I would imagine, you know, a lot of the methodology still applies. It's just different inputs. And, you know, if you're looking at relativity or thinking about sensitivity, all those things are completely relevant. It just might be that the environmental conditions are different. So I think there's not, I wouldn't presume that there's this stark difference in how to understand heat risk in a rural setting versus an urban setting. It's just, what are the mitigative actions to address it? Especially around capacity, perhaps. If there's just fewer resources, you know, trees is not a real thing because this is working land, then what are the other strategies to address resources in more of a sort of heat wave condition versus just growing temperatures? But the landscape itself will continue to be impacted just by the reality of increasing temperature.
Right. I mean, my quick thought would be that community engagement piece is so critical, right? I think that you would probably, so if you're concerned about, let's say it's farm workers or outdoor workers, talking to people who are on the ground working in the occupational setting, they probably have a good sense of what that exposure piece would need to be. And maybe starting off with that simplified approach at the index is probably your best bet to really understanding where you want to start. You know, Evan and I talk a lot about what the purpose of your index should be, and that should always be the motivation to start, because as you saw in our presentation, you can have so many iterations of these indices, and after a while, once you start mapping them, it might start to feel a little bit, your brain might get scrambled. So it's important to know what you want it to, you know, what your intention is going to be, and starting off simple might be very helpful. And working with community members to whom you're going to be communicating the results is going to be, I think, particularly important. I don't know, Evan, if you want to have any closing remarks on that.
Yeah, I just want to mention that we should be doing these at all scales as well. So I am an urban planner. I do them mostly at the urban scale, but there's a lot of evidence that rural areas may actually be at higher risk. We have some research coming out of the Urban Climate Lab recently that shows that housing is extraordinarily important and may actually be more important than the urban heat island in terms of just the magnitude of exposure that people may face. And so if you have an extreme heat event that also affects rural areas, and they live in particularly a single family detached house without any tree shading, their interior temperatures may heat up quite a bit, and those same people are also very far from our healthcare infrastructure. And so that is certainly something that we don't want to forget about, is that our rural areas are going to have very high vulnerability as well. And we should not only create these in urban areas. So just a quick comment on that. I see are we out of time? Do we have time for one last question? We may be out of time.
It's disappointing because we had a bunch that just rolled in that I would love to get to, but we are at the end of the hour. So what I would suggest maybe is these will be recorded anyway, these questions, and so we can address them offline. So if you did ask a question in the last few minutes, we'll try to get you some answers to those. But since we're now at 4 o'clock Eastern, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to all of you. This was a really wonderful conversation. I wish we had 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes for it. But this is not the end. There will be more sessions like this. So today we did constructing heat vulnerability indices, which is just one step in the steps to resilience. So everybody, please join us again on September 2nd, again at 3 p.m. Eastern, for the first webinar in the series of the subset of investigate options. And so we'll be covering the power of the pen, what policy, standards, codes, etc., can be put in place to protect people from extreme heat. So until then, thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to all the speakers one more time, and to Nora and many other people who helped us pull this together. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.